All right, guys, welcome back to the Fitness and Philosophy Podcast. My name is Robbie Gustin. I'm here with James Fitzgerald, founder of OPEX Fitness. James, it sounds like you're in Idaho at the moment.
Yes, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho for the summer. Good morning to you too. It's good to see you again. Episode 3 we are doing.
Yeah. What sort of stuff do you guys do up in Idaho? Any unique activities you guys get to do?
Yeah, well, it's a novel based upon our lifestyle in the desert. So it's the opposite of that. It's cooler weather, there's water, and so you can imagine all the things that go with that. Is the complete opposite. Mountain biking on loom as opposed to like really aggressive rock. You know, although only people who live in the desert will appreciate this, but our lawn is like real grass. And
Right.
that sounds crazy for those who don't recognize what that means, but most lawns in Arizona are either turf or rock, or sand. And so have real grass. It's really cool. And of course the water, we have boats and all the fun things. So that's what we do up here for a couple of months when the girls are off school.
That's really cool.
Yeah. And here's something bigger coming up for you guys. You're getting ready to start fitness again with your local crew there.
Yeah, we're set to open back up on Sunday, and we're excited. We'll see how it all goes.
Yeah.
Brave
Well,
new
good
month.
luck with that. Good luck with that.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
All right. Let's
All right,
nail
guys.
it.
So today we're going to be talking about virtues, vices, and fitness. So
Is there any
uh,
word for fitness that could be a V?
that's a good question.
We could triple V it somehow. That would be a great heading for the podcast episode. So as you're going through this intro, I'll think about a V for fitness.
Okay.
Or maybe I'll just call it Vitness and people will think we're going to come up with something really mind-blowing for the whole thing.
Just some good alliteration.
Yeah.
Um, so James and I were talking about it. I think with these episodes, we're probably going to try to hit, first couple episodes we talked about what is fitness. Last time we talked about autonomy. This time we're talking about virtues and vices. Next time we might talk about epistemology. We're going to kind of touch things here and there, delve in a little bit, and then maybe come back around to different things. But this is a nice connection to fitness and morality knowledge series that you did last week, and also to our autonomy discussion. So what are virtues and what are vices? There are really three main systems of morality that are discussed in philosophy, and virtue ethics is one of them. And we'll almost certainly be discussing the others at later times, so I'll spare us delving in too deep into that. But really, a lot of this comes from Aristotle and his Nicomachean Ethics. Like, if you were looking for like the primary source on this subject, that's a really good one. Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy also has a really good entry on virtue ethics. So, to put it in the most simple and straightforward terms, virtues and vices are states or traits of character. They're dispositions to act and desire and feel in certain ways. They change our constitution in a certain way. So whereas other moral theories focus on, well, obey this rule to do the moral thing, or focus on achieving this consequence, whether that changes you as a person or not, virtue ethics is very heavily invested in what a person grows to be, how they feel, how they see the world, the dispositions they have about how they engage with certain situations. So it's very concerned with how the agent is as a person, what virtues or vices he or she cultivates.
Yeah. And class a little bit, I feel a sense, is there a little bit of like creating classification to what that essence is, or those characteristics, or those, traits that individuals have? Is that what virtues sound to me like? It's like creating some form of classification of placing what those variables are that we see present.
Yeah, I mean, Aristotle and others have a whole worked out system of, a spectrum of each of these, and no one is entirely virtuous. But, to take a famous example, um, you know, charity would be the virtue, and then giving away your money to anyone who asks for it would be, a vice in the sense of just being gullible. And then the vice that we're most familiar with would be like being a miser or a Scrooge or something like that.
Got
So
it.
both of those would be vices opposed to the mean of virtue.
And those, how did Aristotle come up with these? Was it through just seeing experiences and creating this language classification of a continuum of what is, just to use a right or wrong, two different words for it, but um, is that how it came to be? And is it possible that because we're thousands of years removed from that period of time, that there could be like 3x versions of virtues based upon our new experiences as in human nature?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's entirely possible. I mean, that's always an interesting question in any moral discussion about the extent to which are morals universal and timeless. Do they apply, to human beings 2,000 years ago, just as they apply to us now? And has there been any extension since then,
Mm-hmm.
or there are different levels of virtue that, like you were saying, we didn't even realize back then? So, in terms of how he came up with them, I mean, it was very much both a bottom up and a top down. So bottom up meaning like looking out at the world at generals and politicians and other wise people, um, and abstracting from that to see what are the collective elements that make someone um, a good and virtuous person and what makes up the happy life, but also some top down thinking about like what is the worthwhile life that we want to achieve. So a bit of both.
Okay, cool. That's
Yeah.
great. That would have been fascinating to be alive at that period of time.
Yeah,
Right?
just I mean, you know, literature and history and philosophy and just yeah.
Wow. Yeah, cool.
Um, so in super simplistic terms, a virtue makes its possessor good and a vice makes its possessor bad. Like we want to be super binary and just kind of like straightforward. That's a good way to start. So some examples: authenticity, inauthenticity, benevolence, malevolence, courage, cowardice, selflessness, selfishness, honesty, deceit, wisdom, ignorance. So again, the goal with virtue ethics is to try and take ourselves from one end of the spectrum, as it were, and try to bring ourselves closer to um, these dispositions that actually change how we feel. And this is an interesting debate between Aristotle and Kant that we might get into later on. For Kant, you kind of have a duty to act morally whether you like it or not. You doing the right thing and not stealing the millionth time over may not change the fact that you still want to have a ton of money. You
Mm-hmm.
may still have that
Mm-hmm.
internal disposition. For Aristotle, there's a really heavy notion, and it's super interesting about like how malleable our wants are. But there's this deep intuition and belief for Aristotle that as you do more virtuous things, it changes your internal constitution. It changes your wants. You no longer want to do the bad thing, doing sufficient things virtuously for a period of time. The famous movie that's always associated with Aristotle's ethics is Groundhog Day, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, goes from being kind of a selfish jerk to repetitive behaviors and learning to be a bit more selfless.
Yeah, is it possible that the argument of that could be that if people are not aware, they could actually get into a like compensatory, pleasurable system that they think is upgrading, but it's actually just leading to a downgraded version?
It could be. I mean, that's definitely a counter argument one could make against the um, position. And you could also ask, like, how malleable are our wants in the first place?
Yeah,
Is it
yeah,
true that doing the same thing repetitively actually changes our wants?
yeah, exactly.
So,
Yeah,
um,
I tried to tie it into how we see in fitness, where people see, and we'll get to that as well. What's I guess the common language for today of virtue signaling this correct alignment, what they think is a correct alignment, but they're actually going in a direction that is futile to their system. They're leading to an area that they really do believe is the right way, and they continually, of
right,
course, create pleasure inside of this, and this is definitely right, this is definitely right, and they keep doing it as this is definitely right, and they're not
right.
going in the right way. So yeah.
I think I mean, no, that's a good point. Like the epistemology of, those moral feelings, so to speak. Like how do you tune into the fact that, you feeling good doing a certain thing is, indicative of it being right.
Yeah,
I
the
think,
right thing. Mm-hmm.
Aristotle would say something to the effect of, it feeling good wouldn't be sufficient, of course, but it would be a piece of the puzzle. But I think that is a good question.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, a really good quote that kind of sums up this whole way of thinking is comes from Aristotle, where he says, for instance, fear, confidence, appetite, anger, pity, and in general pleasure and pain may be felt both too much and too little, and in all cases not well. But to feel them at the right times, with reference to the right people, with the right motive, and in the right way, is what is both intermediate and best, and this is characteristic of virtue. So if you had to kind of sum up virtue ethics and that way of viewing things, that really kind of sums it up.
Yeah, how I read that is you almost have to push up against either to kind of feel out exactly what is the definition, right?
Yeah.
He kind of lays both sides of the street and says this is here and this is here, and I guess it probably goes further back to natural laws of yin and yang and natural causes and human nature in regard. Sorry, I guess naturalism in regards to the sun and the moon, and you don't really know one or the other unless you have one to push up against. You know.
Yeah, I think so. And I think one of the interesting connections that I thought we could talk about with regard to fitness, there's this concept of what's called phronesis in virtue ethics. And it's a fancy, it's just the Greek term for practical wisdom. And it's basically the idea that you can't be truly virtuous unless you have these experiences of these different situations that you have encountered morally, um, to then know what the consequences are going to be and how other people are going to react. And I think there's an interesting discussion we can have about fitness wisdom,
Oh,
about
there's
like,
no doubt. Oh my gosh, that's a deep one, especially for fitness coaching, right? So how do you be able to explain or speak about experiences? As I say that a lot, that CCP is like the book of experiences dumbed down into this framework of experiences. But how do you really validate what those truths are unless you're capable of experiencing it, so that you can act upon it as a virtue, like you just said? I think that's definitely that will warrant a discussion further down the road, maybe titled, um, virtues of fitness coaching, maybe, or or sorry, maybe it's can you, because I think I did a knowledge series on it one time. It was I languaged it, how can you life coach if you haven't lived a life?
right.
So there's experiences that I now know of being a parent, and seeing the birth of my two children, that as just that example, I could definitely speak to it on a much more rich level, because it's an experience. So then we're going to get into areas of like where, well, how do you essentially not just get 65-year-old people to eventually become fitness coaches because they're the only ones that have really lived, you know what I'm saying? So that's where
Right.
the tension's going to occur. Yeah. But
Yeah,
cool.
I mean, there's definitely that balance, but there is some truth to it. I mean, even things like the CCP experience, or even you can read a workout, or you can read a book about coaching, or read a book about virtues, but there's this whole other element of knowledge that comes from having engaged in that activity.
Yeah.
Um, and Aristotle famously says, or well, in virtue ethics, they famously say, look, a kid who's acting in accordance with virtue, it's good and it's the right direction, but it's still not quite the full on virtue that we're looking for, because they haven't had the right experiences of all these different situations to develop that phronesis to be able to you know determine what they should do in different situations. And the
Mm.
experience is crucial. You can't be moral without it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And so the language here too, because we're talking more right now at this point in time on virtue. Are we pushing also the differences in virtue and how it applies to fitness? Also, virtues, vices in fitness.
yeah, I mean, I thought there were a few different directions we could go, and
Okay.
you tell me what appeals most to you, but I thought potentially one direction we could go is, to what extent does fitness by itself contribute to what virtues and vices would be for us in our general lives? How does it make us better or potentially worse
Yes.
people, depending on what we're talking about?
Yeah.
And then the reverse: how do virtues and vices in general life apply to fitness? And then another one that I figured we could discuss is, are there any virtues and vices that are unique to fitness that extend beyond patience, or perseverance, or confidence, or courage, or things like that?
Yeah. I like all those. Yeah.
So those are kind of the things I was thinking about.
Okay. I like them all.
Yeah, I think they definitely, yeah, there's a lot to be said, I think. So, again, going back to this notion for Aristotle of virtue being a mean between two extremes, this is part of the reason why, if anyone ever wonders, like, why is it hard to be moral? I mean, not in every instance, of course, but morality is hard. Doing the right thing is hard. And part of the reason that you can cash out when you think about Aristotle's ethics is that there are at least two ways to be wrong and, closer to one way to be right, in the sense of, there are these excesses of, or excuse me, vices of excess and vices of deficiency. So for honesty, honesty is the virtue, and being a liar is a vice of deficiency, and being a blabbermouth is a vice of excess, right? Like vomiting the truth is not good either,
Yeah, great description.
in any
Yeah,
situation.
yeah.
So
Oh, I love that term. That just changed my perspective on um, vices.
in the sense of there being multiple different variations.
Well, of what I was probably thinking that people were doing as signaling certain virtues, but actually they were just doing an extensive array of vice, um, blabbermouthing. I mean, as soon as you said that, I was like, oh my gosh, has been languaged and even in my own head or thought of as being people thinking whatever they were talking about was virtuous, but really it's not. It just shows not the opposite of virtue in being a deficiency, but it's an excess as a vice. Oof.
Yeah, and I think people tend to forget that. Like when I read out the virtues to begin with, people think like, well, okay, wisdom, ignorance, honesty, deceit. But the truth is there are multiple different ways to
Yeah.
not be in line with that central virtue.
Yeah.
Um, I would say the other really important characteristic feature of virtue ethics, and there's a ton to say here, so I'm really just kind of summing up stuff, but
That's
the
good.
other really interesting piece that I think we could discuss with relation to fitness is that virtue and the good life or the happy life and fulfillment are intrinsically linked for Aristotle and for virtue ethics. When we think of happiness or joy or like the good life, sometimes that involves morality. Sometimes it doesn't. A lot of times it involves, cars, money, planes, things like that, and, hedonistic pleasures and things like that. But for Aristotle and for virtue ethics more generally, this notion of eudaimonia, which is like fulfillment, um, you know, purpose, happiness in a very deep and meaningful sense, is intrinsically linked with virtue. And Aristotle's definition of eudaimonia or happiness is really the following. He says, it is an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. That's what fulfillment or happiness or deep, profound sort of success in life consists in, and that's intrinsically worthwhile and worth pursuing for Aristotle. So it's an interesting question in fitness. Does fitness help us achieve that? Is there something similar in fitness that we try to achieve besides happiness that's intrinsically worthwhile? But that's a deep element of the view.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking, not that you're asking that particular question or for me to come up with the answer to that, but when you were saying it, I'm glad that there was some definition of what content and being fulfilled was. Um, and as we move over into fitness, I can see how someone can still go through what they deem to be pleasurable and virtuous inside of fitness, but and they really do think it leads to fulfillment. So it still comes back to what I believe. There's no rule of our previous discussions on this definition of how fitness plays a role in the good life. There's no rules, or there has been no written things to follow by or to practice around saying these are physical expressions you could partake in that lead you to this highest form of whatever we're calling potential, and that's what we're calling a really fulfilled, content life, right? Because I think inside of fitness, it's very possible that, um, to use your words, it's perceived as money, cars, and hedonistic behaviors that really people still can say, I've experienced fitness to the fullest and I'm still quite content and fulfilled. Do you know what I'm saying? Because we define, I think we have defined in fitness, or I have defined in fitness, I should say, um, this, well, it's been injected inside of the definition of fitness success, but that, standing upright past 75 is our definition of like, we made it. I mean, just being upright. So can you get out of your chair when you're 75? Well, okay, that was good, right? And now we're having conversation on like, let's move that to 90, and we can stand up at 90, we're good to go. Do you see what I'm saying? So nowhere in there talks about what I like the word is fulfilled. Inside of fulfilled is filled, right? You fill the potential, right? You fill what you're fully capable of, not what the precedent has been set on how people live their life. So that's what I think about, Robbie, and carrying over into fitness is that I believe it's a ripe opportunity for us to like define this concept of what could be virtuous and have a fulfilled life through fitness, because just like we now know over many, many years of experience, there are people who participate in hedonistic behaviors of, money and cars, and then just use your example, right? And they really do believe that's happiness, and that's the happy, worthy life, right? So who are we to decide that that is not the case? And so that's why I like Aristotle's definition of it, is that it's got to come down to that, how you perceive it. And if you really inside your soul are dictating it being virtuous, it's probably a good path. So yeah, a lot in there that
No, I think those are good points. And I mean, Aristotle has, arguments to get, he runs through the gamut of like, oh, well, is it just hedonistic pleasure? Well, no, because hedonistic pleasure kind of runs out and it's not fulfilling and you keep wanting more. Well, is it power, esteem, and prestige? Well, that's dependent on other people. And, so a big part of this fulfillment idea is, for Aristotle at least, and I think it relates to your notion of autonomy that we've talked about, is kind of a self-sufficiency, to a certain extent. That it doesn't depend on these external, pleasures. It doesn't depend on external prestige. So he considers these famous ones that people rattle off for happiness, and he says, nah, doesn't quite cut it. And I think in fitness, we can, do something similar where we say, well, okay, you think this way of engaging in fitness is the true way or is leading to fulfillment, but here's why maybe we could consider why it might not be.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that takes some stretching out for each individual to determine, again, like we had previously discussed, what that definition is of potential inside the fulfilled life, right? And if we don't dissect in that, I think it's very easy to say something is virtuous inside the fulfilled life of fitness, but we're just assuming so.
Right. Yeah, no, I agree.
We're just assuming
so. So in terms of, how do fitness and virtue relate, kind of what you were asking, I'm open to taking any one of these, but I thought, a couple questions we could ask, would be one, how can fitness contribute to the cultivation of vices and virtues in general life? And I think an interesting contrast here that we can discuss is the athletic case. I think our society is rife with, and not that that's a bad thing, but okay, be part of a team for team building, competitiveness, and graciousness. But I think it's interesting, specifically given, your definition of fitness, to talk about how can the fitness journey contribute to us being better people, to us becoming more patient, gracious, things like that.
Yeah.
Thoughts?
Yeah, for sure. Well, lots in there, but because you brought up the athlete piece, I think the athlete piece is a nice, well-placed area of virtuous intentions from the 80s and 90s. As the 70s and 80s like really exhausted this whole concept of, let's just do fitness because, Jane Fonda and Jack LaLanne and Schwarzenegger are doing it. Now, we start to see this more scientific revolution of what fitness is. And inside the scientific revolution, the only way that you're going to get academic papers moved or interest in terms of fitness is to study the science of performance or disease. And so when you have this like performance white paper information that comes out in the 90s up until now ad nauseum, it's all linked to that, like, how do we get better, connected to the performance indices, right? So performance means it's all wrapped inside of athleticism performance, which on the base level, as you know, and intentions is for people to kill each other. It's sacrificial. It's for, I use the 4 Ps, pain, pleasure, points, and prizes. That's the intentions inside of that. So immediately in the athletic realm, for all that we know to be and what's inside of our practices for fitness, it's directly connected to sacrificing your body, right? That's the deepest intentions inside of it. So, and then above that, to your point, which is a good one, it's a great place to go because there's discomfort, like we know, in pushing up against one side or the other. So on that side of athleticism, we push up against sacrifice, going beyond our capabilities, incorrect intentions aligned with, I can be LeBron James, I can do those things too. And so maybe slightly to the left of it, there are some virtues in there that we can pull from it, which I'm definitely interested in trying to understand more, because I move further over to this side as my base support to say, I want your deepest intentions to not look like that, right? So I want your deepest intentions to be that, you're moving because you can and because it's for you. But I like asking the question as to what are these things we can get inside of this, fitness experience that are human virtues, right? And I'll just name a few that we can, kind of play with. I'm just thinking of the biological things, and some of the cognitive things, but I think strategy and trying to overcome a solution to a movement is a really, really virtuous act as a human. And there's so much beauty and time in that. That's why I find it so beautiful, is that you're never going to be faced with some solution to movement challenges that you will immediately overcome, right? Where we just don't have we have too many biological constraints to say that for your whole life, every time you meet a physical challenge, someone's going to get it like that. They're going to have to take time. And then when they get to there, it's like, well, now you're there. Now there's more challenges, So that's the beautiful thing of this thing inside. So I think strategy of overcoming movement solutions is a really deep, virtuous thing that people can learn inside of fitness. I think sustainability and pacing it seems like a physiological language, but it's deeper rooted in you being able to continue to do practice of fitness. So when people learn how to pace, they are essentially saying that they know what they're capable of expressing really well. They know what they're capable of doing right now, but they also know how to just pull back a little bit so they can continue to do that work, right? So I'll just propose 2 there. I think other areas that I'd be less comfortable talking about, Robbie, but maybe you believe there's something that inside of that for the community, sharing physical challenges with other humans, teamwork, and some other those areas that could probably be derived in a fitness landscape. But then, of course, I'm going to push up against that, because if we're going to define and back up and say, what is autonomy, you eventually have to have some of those competencies inside that are self-derived, that are going to allow you to do those strategies and pacing scenarios, by yourself with a little guidance from a coach. But I'll just stop there. I think there's a number of things there if you wanted to add to it.
Yeah, no, I think those are a number of good points. I mean, I take it from what you're, saying, take pacing, for example, and that I think starts to answer the question, are there unique virtues in fitness? You're saying strategy as well, but I think taking the pacing example, there's an extent to which that can, lead to patience, which is of course a virtue in general life, to moderation, rather than going beyond one's capabilities, things of that nature. So it's an interesting connection between the two, the way fitness can actually lead you to, in a certain sense, be a better person overall, by having engaged in these activities, maybe even a more moral or virtuous person.
Yeah, I know, excuse me, I know you're not done with that, but the first thing I thought about there, if I could interject, is that it's because it's the common case that a lot are not patient in participation of fitness today.
Right.
So, and as you know, there's, I usually say after that all the time, there's no right or wrong to that. but maybe there is. Whereas that if you're showing the practice of impatience, how good is that for you? How
Right.
good is that for you long term? And in a lot of cases, I don't think it's quite virtuous.
No, I agree. And one thing I was just thinking about as you were speaking is, um,
But the system wants us to do that. That's the thing.
that's true. Very
So,
much so.
yeah.
Um, with Plato and Aristotle, if you go back enough, you do see some, obviously gymnasticon and all these, there is a connection with physical culture, and, they talk about it to a certain extent in its relation to being a better person and the good life. But, when you think about Kant or utilitarianism or more modern moral theory, I can't, and I could be wrong. If someone can think of some example they can put in the comments. I'm having a hard time thinking of physical culture being discussed in relation to morality today. And I think
Yeah.
this is something, that maybe we're perhaps helping to bring back here, like back with Plato and Aristotle, there was this notion of connecting physical culture and virtue and being a better person that's just been lost. If you ask most people what's necessary to be moral, um, I can't imagine too many people would mention fitness as even a remote component of the equation, but I feel like it can play a role and perhaps should play a role. So
Yeah.
that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah. Oh, well, yes.
Now that
Resounding yes.
discussing this.
Do you want me to agree with you? Because I do. Yeah, no, I use the terminology like it's this, the way I think about it is it's like breakfast. It's a part of society, and it's a part of our normal day-to-day functioning, and it's almost should be up against like vocation. And I forget what some of the philosophers' initial thoughts were on categorizing things you should do during the day, or things that most do during the day: labor, relations, and play, or something like that. And the physical experience stuff, to your point, I believe is just it's just been so beat up. We actually don't even recognize it as being possibly virtuous anymore. Because it's been wrapped with so many other vices. There you have it. There's the word. Like it's been wrapped with vices of short-term processes, and relieving pain, and decreasing what society says I should be at or get to. And be good to your neighbors. That was a well, I mean, I guess it's less today because of just different behaviors in communities and stuff. But in the 60s, be good to your neighbors or know your neighbors, it seemed like a common, yeah, that may just make sense, right? We want to live with one another. We want to share value, physically express with everyone daily. It's like, what? You see what I'm saying? It's like we're so deep into that being almost attached to it being a vice now, that it's almost a incorrect, malaligned behavior generations deep, that it would be tough to come out of. But I agree with you. Yes, I think it should be languaged something like breakfast, and I think there's a lot of great things inside of it. I was also thinking, as you were mentioning that, of this other, I mentioned strategy, and I also mentioned pace, but there's something that you said there that remind me that there's no real exemplars today in society for it. As I mentioned on the Fitness Morality Knowledge series, there's no shining light, there's no beacon, and it's just no one's willing to say that it's quite virtuous to push up against potential. And I think that is virtuous. So strategy, pace, and pushing up against potential, not past your capabilities, right? Pushing up against what you're currently capable of today, right? So everything that you do, every time you participate in movement, to take the simplistic terms, you're going to go for a hike and you're to discover nature and move. And the next time you do it, you're going to go for 2 more minutes. Push up against what your limitations are. And that, I think, is where the sweet spot is in the learning of what is virtuous, right? You get to push up against what limits me. Am I physically limited? Am I cognitively limited? Is there, and I think then we can go in the path, Robbie, so I saw in your PDF notes of like, where do these like virtues and characteristics come from and how are they derived, so that people could know like, well, why when I get to that 2 mile barrier, things just stop, why is that the case? And I think the being at the 2 mile is the most beautiful virtue, right? So you're getting to like what your limitations are, what your struggles are, what the tension is, that, but you can see what's masked inside of that, or how I'm describing it is that we want to invoke this, this concept through our language, Robbie, and our discussions, so people can start thinking about what does it mean to try to be at my most potential, right? My potential all the time and forever and ever. Amen. And I think that is virtuous. And how to drive that and why you should do it and how do you balance it and how do you not tip over? That's all, technical things that people can do. But I really don't think that there's a space for this, to use your words, of mediocrity, or sorry, you said in moderation. Well, in this area, it's great to push above moderation for the physical experience level. Yeah, so it's 3 there, I guess. Strategy, pace, and potential. Lots of
Yeah,
virtuous things in there.
I agree with that. And 2 things came to mind as you were saying that. So one, going back to the team example, if we think of virtue as a lifelong journey and fitness as a lifelong journey, I mean, one of the things that we see in society today, and just by the very nature of athletics, people are athletic and they're on teams for high school, maybe college, and then maybe they're on a pickup team. But you put this limit almost on what you can, if we're saying that athletics and, team sports are the only ways you can kind of cultivate these virtues physically, we're missing out on a whole lifetime essentially of, getting to your physical potential. What about fitness itself? This notion we've been talking about of a lifelong practice where you're pushing up against your potential. And I think the second thing I was thinking of is you mentioned the idea of exemplars. For virtue ethics, this is a central idea that the virtuous person is one that, has spent a lifetime cultivating virtue and has essentially mastered it. And people look to them as paradigms. And again, if we kind of just look to the team sports or athletics, not that there's anything wrong with that, not that you can't glean something from that, but who's doing football for 80 years?
Yep.
I don't know
Yep.
anyone. But
Yep.
fitness, as we described it, you can do, right?
Yes.
Right. So
Yes.
there's a notion there.
Yeah. No. Yeah. By all means, there's so many examples we could use of the athletic mindset that just falls to nothing. When you get inside of what's inside of it, I would definitely put the score of 86-14, let's say, on the side of like what's good inside the health framework as opposed to the athletic framework. There's a lot of areas in which it doesn't connect to what we're talking about in virtuous pieces. And I don't know if it's neither here nor there, but you do bring up a point when you said lifetime. I think that's where fitness has been lost, is as an example of one area inside the public school systems. Their definition of physical expression is sport participation, right? Like my child is scored on how fit they are and how well they can overcome movement solution challenges by if they keep their elbow straight on a free throw that they learned in school. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, and that's not fitness. So what you see in that example is sport has just encroached on this lack of, really it's a lack of direction on behalf of adults that should be saying like it shouldn't be judged and you should just learn how to do these physical expression things. So to my point I made on the knowledge series, by the time you're 18 on our last call, you should just be able to understand what to do to push up against your potential, and to keep doing it forever. And when you said also the team aspect too, I couldn't help but think which is probably another topic, another time to talk about, the self versus others and the coach client, itself. And, because helping the self first is probably, I would argue, also very virtuous. So, taking care of, like, do you have the pieces before you want to do something virtuous like teaching others? So take care of your experiences and your ability and be good in your shoes, and then you can help others. And then when you're helping others, and you get good at that, then you can help the system. And then when you're good at helping the system, then you can help the collective. And it's in that order, right?
Right.
Back to the point of what you said of team. Well, I think a lot of people jump to these virtuous ideas of helping others and strategizing for a common goal, but they really don't have the ultimate base supportive potential of themselves figured out yet. Which is why I think you get a lot of people kicked out of the high school sports situation, and they can't wait to discover fitness on their own, because they sense that, like, I need to work on myself, and my
Right.
own physical experiences. And they never got that because they were doing like systematic things, right? They weren't even really even at the coach level of helping others. They were not even at taking care of self. So those are some things I thought about. And I love the exemplar conversation. I'm not sure if we just want to table that for another time too, but to discuss, maybe we can come up with strategies, Robbie, that could inspire a whole lot of our listeners or people that listen to not only use these things we talk about as what virtuous and what I call like coach attributes, but we can spread that good news of what it means to be an exemplar and really well define that, and so that can bleed out and people can see those people as the, like you call them, the paradigm shakers and shifters. And people and folks, maybe we need to create thousands of Jack LaLannes,
Right.
just doing it for the right reason. And it's quite virtuous in my opinion.
I agree. And I mean, again, not that there's nothing wrong with Tom Brady. There's nothing wrong with LeBron James. There's nothing wrong
Mm.
with any of those folks. But when, culturally, that's what you look to as your paradigm or your only exemplar of fitness, and that ends at what, mid-30s. I mean, Tom Brady's kind of an outlier, but do you know what I mean? Like
Yep.
when you don't have these fitness exemplars for people to look to, it tends to, um, I think make it harder for people and kids to know what to aim for. Do you know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like,
Yeah.
to see what direction they should be going in.
Oh, for sure. But you speak of again, we're repeating it, but you're speaking of where populism, and popularity and sensationalism and objectification of our bodies or what we do are seemingly virtuous, and it's tied into fitness. I'm not sure how that happened.
Yeah.
Like I'm not sure how that happened. Like, how did Tom Brady end up being a spokesperson for green smoothies and working out? Like, how did that happen? If anything, which you're not going to have, but I want that, 42-year-old father of three, who works his ass off, to provide, and works out 4 times a week and is just continuing to learn like what he's up against and what he's trying to do and pushing up against what is healthy and what can allow him to keep doing what he wants to do. I mean, that's our exemplar, right? That's our exemplar, not
Right.
popularity, and how it, just pulled in fitness somehow. But again, that came back in the athletic realm where everything inside of academia and every coach then pushed that, oh, I mean, you got to have your power clean and bench press at these ratios because that's what they saw in fitness, in fitness testing for athletes. So I mean, it's the epitome, it's like, well, is it, because there's no well-defined, structural balance to live long and prosper, just to use a simple example of, lifting and structural balance not being necessarily virtuous for health. So anyways, you raised some interesting points of the athleticism aspect of it.
Yeah, I agree with what you said. And I mean, I think one other thing that I'm thinking of as you're, talking about this is, in virtue ethics and for Aristotle, there's this very deep-seated notion that virtue is a lifelong practice. That's number one, and it's intrinsically worthwhile. And I think when if we talk about our conception of fitness that we've been talking about, not what passes for it these days, but the version of what we've been discussing, I think both of those things are centrally related to it. So one, it's a practice. A practice essentially doesn't stop. You keep doing it, right? You engage in it and get challenged by it, and it's a lifelong endeavor. And two, it's intrinsically worthwhile. So not the points, not because your coach said so, not because you get the $1 million contract. Again, not that there's anything wrong with that if that's what you're shooting for, but intrinsic worth. So those thoughts are kind of coming to mind. And any thoughts there?
Oh yeah. Well, I'm just going to take it from a lens of a father with two kids who I'm just asked that question of my two young girls post soccer practice, you know, and for the past couple of years, they've been preyed upon by multiple different coaches and different systems of even parents of trying to sneak in this like specialization. Like I really think Hannah, if she like practiced 3 more times a week with this club, she'll really get to this worthwhile capability. Do you see that? So they throw in this like it's worthy to specialize and do this one thing really well. So that's what I think about. I think your indirect question there, Robbie. I think it needs more time spent on what's that defining aspect of what is worthy and what is worthwhile. And I think it's not only tied into practice and being consistent, which is beautiful, because if you don't participate in good virtuous things, you can't practice anymore. You push beyond your capabilities. But what is worthy, I think there's a time stamp inside that also. Do you know what I'm saying? So like for Hannah, she could do it 5 days a week for the next 4 years, but now she has, mechanical issues about her knee when she's 19.
Right.
Do you see that? So that's not that worthy. And the story's been told a million times, just that we don't want to, we turn our back on it. So that's what I immediately think about I think we need to define what is worthwhile.
Yeah, I agree.
And how do you define worthwhile?
I mean, I think a place to start where you're right. I mean, with any philosophical question, especially like that, it gets really deep. But I do think just in us discussing it, one really pretty prominent contrast case, and you can correct me, if you think something different here, but for a lot of other forms of fitness, it's all tied up in extrinsic worth. The weight you are going to lose, the BPM on your heart rate monitor, the miles you're going to run, the contract you're going to gain. And I think it's not that we don't aim at those things in the type of fitness we're talking about. It's not that we don't, want to set PRs or things like that. But I think there is this notion, what we've been talking about, of intrinsic worth, the practice itself, not for contracts, not for points, like you say, because you are a physical being. I think that's at least some way to get some purchase on the notion of worth that we're trying to get at in a way that contrasts with those other forms.
Yes. Yeah. And I think you can maybe then tie in other virtues beyond what I had said for potential strategy and pace with that practice, right? Like maybe you can continually move because you can, and it's for you, because it allows you to push up against your potential. It allows you to learn what strategy means of fun and play and challenges, which to every human, overcoming movement solutions is very enjoyable if no one's ever, been on an American Ninja Warrior course. And then pacing, which I think, as you know, I beat that horn for the past 2 decades, but I always knew there was something really beautiful inside of learning gears, right? Like
Right.
this thing does have gears, and there's not like 67. There's 3 major ones, and then there's like some different versions of all of them and what's good and what's not. But to learn what those things mean, I just think it's worthwhile. Just speaking to we just came up with some strategies for my kids this summer. How I use my teach, learn, move, create thing that inspires me as beacons for what I do, and try to keep in my lane, and things that really light me up to stay a part of. Well, we just created this list for the kids this summer, and I spoke to Chloe about it this morning. And under move, I underlined it and I said, every day we're going to move long and short. And so in her question, it was like, so what does that mean, Dad, in long and short? And so I described it as like, we want to participate in biking together, and go for long distances and go across land and play with that. And we also want to move short, meaning like the timeline of it, the challenges are much harder, right? And we want to practice that daily as daily practice because it's, interesting to participate in. And she understood that. She understood that we want to go for long walks and hikes like we do, but we also want to do some of our little circuits and workouts that we do out there in the gym, because they're challenges that she's like, oh, I don't even know if I can do that. It's like, oh, cool. That's a short movement challenge. So to my point that I think is not there that much in the landscape for the young person. And I think that it's probably going to help you and I define what is worthy, is if people can understand that a little deeper.
Yeah, and I think one potential fitness virtue that came to mind that I'm curious to hear your thoughts about, like there's a good there are a couple of good websites that just kind of list, the standard 20 to 50 virtues or vices or whatever you like, just kind of the standard ones that people would think of. And I didn't see one on there with strength. You might say, well, moral fortitude or something like that, but what about just physical strength, and how does that relate to fortitude? And does getting stronger make us better people? Thoughts on that being a unique virtue that contributes?
Yeah, I could probably understand why it's not in the language, but I would say that the way that you and I see it in our lens, I think it's probably embedded somewhere in there for the wording of resilience,
Yeah.
because when I think of strength, I think I see it, immediately as an expression of something aggressive and something really physically challenging. Right now, the more and more you do it, you start seeing strength is more than that. Right, strength is now also an assessment of who you are. Right, strength is now also an opportunity for you to test what you're capable of. Strength now is also an opportunity for you to see aspects of strategy, because it can become technical. It could also be pacing, meaning that you want to do some of these contractions not as frequently as you would like, as I know, as you age, right? I can't do the really heavy shit every 2 days now. So I see strength now as being more than just that hard physical challenge. So I can understand why the language is tough, but I see the word resilience in there, because what you experience through the practice of physical expression, and let's say in this characteristic, strength, when you practice that over and over, you get to see how resilient you are, right? Like how do you put up with an imposed, either willful or unknown stressor, right? So how do you put up with that? Meaning, just as an example, the kettlebell goes in a slightly different trajectory, right? That's an aspect of you learning about how strong you are to overcome that perturbation, right? Do you see? It's not about the weight of the kettlebell. It's like, were you resilient enough to put up with that new stressor? And so that's how I see strength developing over time as a virtue. Is in its continual practice, it becomes an assessment, and it becomes a feedback, and it becomes an opportunity to really see how resilient you are, because there's so much simplicity in it that you just can't escape its truths. So that's why I like it as a virtue, if that made sense, of opening that up as a possible virtue.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And it makes me think and wonder, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts here. When we typically think of the notion of resilience, you could say someone's resilient when their tire goes flat, and how do they react to it when they take a test. We have all these different intellectual and emotional examples of resilience, but I kind of wonder the extent to which, let's say someone has that aspect, they've experienced that type of stuff, but haven't experienced any sort of physical resilience in the sense of trying to build strength? Are they missing out in a certain way, insofar as they are a human being, on a crucial component of resilience that just is, you know, a huge piece of who we are? Like maybe
Yes.
the moral language has lost this physical part.
Oh, no doubt. No doubt. It's when I talk about potential, um, I'm assuming, and I'm glad you're, uh, opening up what I just assume is probably in our room. It just makes sense, but I would agree with you. We should discuss it because not a lot of people think that way, of what you and I may know to be true, Robbie, of how these physical expression challenges lead us to learning more about that definition of resilience. Right. And to answer your question, yes, I do believe it's been pushed to the curb, of this acceptance of you should participate in continuous physical challenges that at least test what your potential is and what your capabilities are, right? Safely and monitored and in the correct direction. Why? Because it will allow you to determine just how resilient you are by seeing how you react to those things, those physical challenges. And I just take it for granted that I could tell you 1,000 stories of physical challenges that I went through that taught me a whole lot around a virtuous life in the non-physical realm. I mean, there's so much power inside that physical expression that people move up against, right? That say things, because then the weight says back to you, you can't do that. You can't do that. And so here lies in this beautiful opportunity, if humans are aware enough to go, now how am I going to deal with that? How am I
Right.
going to deal with that? And that right there is the measure of resilience as a characteristic that gets hopefully moved into their character development because they went through the physical experience.
Yeah, and two thoughts are coming to mind there. So one is the type of resilience I think you develop in fitness is similar to, but not the same as, qualitatively different, I think, or, it's a different type of experience that you would be missing out on if you didn't partake in those types of activities. Um, it's a unique type of resilience that you may not get from these other types of things like taking a test, or, how stressed are you when your tire goes flat or what have you. And then the second thing is, I think culturally people think, well, fitness is just one way you could test your resilience, right? You could test it by, doing a whole bunch of other things, but you could be perfectly resilient not having done any fitness, right? Not having engaged in any strength activities. And I think part of the question we're asking here is, and I think it's really interesting, is to what extent are you actually missing out on a crucial component of being a human being and even being a virtuous human being by not having that physical expression and that strength challenge and that resilience challenge? In other words, is strength and physical challenges, are they just one among other ways of testing your resilience that you could just toss to the side and say, I don't need that. I could do it if I like it, but I don't need it. Or is it intrinsic to being a human being that you need to experience this, and that teaches you more about resiliency that you could get from other experiences? Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. And I just don't, again, I don't think there's enough exemplars around, or people that have lived the full life, so that we could move. Because what I see there is that we're, or this is how I'm seeing it, is that we're asking, how much potential of body do we need to do versus how much potential of mind that allows us to determine what a fulfilled life is. So
Right.
again, I go back to filled. If we say filled, uh, and we be reductionist, of mind and body, and however you want to diverge what mind means and consciousness and belief and spirit and etc. Those non-material things, material and immaterial. Yes, I would say that under my definition, you're not truly fulfilled at the end if you're just upright at 85, but you haven't for those 85 years expressed as much, pushing up against your potential in the body as you did the mind. And I would even argue, go further to say, because I've experienced this and I've observed this for so long, but again, you're not going to have, there's people that have talked about, but you're not going to have um, a lot for it, is how this um, um, pushing up against potential physically, and I'll define that so it doesn't seem like we're just narcissistic maniacs doing fitness all the time. I would argue that leads to a even better production of what you can do cognitively than if you only did mind stuff alone, for your whole life. So yes, I think that there's um, in that dual portion of just putting them down, I think that we've really lost that um, we've lost the wonder, and the mystery around, just trying to train our bodies and physically express, even for things we may not even know, Robbie, can occur, right? But you and I know it, but a lot don't. And so I think that there is more. I think you have a more fulfilled person who has moved in potential for their whole life against mind and body together.
So it's not, it's not just one among other resiliency challenges, and you can be like, oh, well, I want these ones, and not these physical ones. It's, we're saying to a certain extent that those body challenges are a necessary part of being a fulfilled human being. You
Yes.
can't get the same quality of resiliency from just engaging in other mentally challenging tasks or emotionally challenging tasks.
Yeah, and yes, and I want to add to it by saying you can even be more resilient in those mentally challenging tasks the more potential you push on the body.
Right.
Yeah. Now, as I said, there's a number of people who talk about that, but they also don't want to. They like our best thinkers, today, or the ones that cognitively are like consistently challenging new beliefs and really pushing out there. No one investigates what their lifestyle is. Like, what did they do? And a lot of them in lots of practice just kind of put it to the curb as the physical training just being something like, oh yeah. But when you dig into it, they're like, oh yeah, I just do jujitsu every day and maybe go for a 30-minute run with my dog. What I mean? It's like, why are you saying I just do that? Like those are examples that you need to be like telling everyone, right? So that you could say, what gets me to be able to do these really cognitively challenging things that has a long time for me being able to express this is me doing these physical challenges, right? And you can see, I think we've just taken it for granted to investigate that on a much deeper level. Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, of course, it's, as I said, the whole notion is this mediocre living that we've been okay with, that we're upright at 85. It's like, you did it, it's like, well, did you, did you? And I think we're really afraid of thinking that we'll get all these pleasurable hedonistic things removed if we like focus on fitness. That's what I think that society has a real deep feeling for, especially when they see me come out and say it, right? Take my shirt off and no hair on. I'm like doing thrusters. They're like, how in the heck is that contributing to your mind being better? So I think we got a good challenge in front of us for that.
Yeah, I agree. So here might be a fun one. I'm curious to hear your thoughts here. We've been talking about the virtues in fitness and how they relate to the virtuous life. What are the vices in fitness, or in this kind of I guess realm that we're discussing? What are the ways things can go wrong? If pacing is the virtue,
Mm-hmm.
um, if strength is the virtue, if strategy is the virtue, what are the ways those can go wrong, and what are we trying to correct against?
Yeah, I think it's the way that I'm understanding vices. I think it's um, participation or things that lead to maladaptive behaviors in the practice. So anything that falls into that would be considered a vice. So that would mean addiction, doing it for whatever reasons that are going to be futile over time or lead to your demise or injury or harm or self-deprecation kind of, movements. Um, I think that anything that's probably going to lead to an increased speed of wear and tear, um, a anything that's going to push regular occurrence beyond your capabilities. I think those are all covering whatever you want to call underneath them vices. I classify it into what most current behaviors are today for the intentions inside of fitness. Look good naked, decrease pain, and have more energy. So those would be the global reasons why people participate in physical expression, and all three of them are vices. They're going towards a fix for something that really doesn't lead to or Aristotle's beautiful definition of the consistent practice that's worthwhile. And I think you're going to end up getting into that, what I guess I describe it as, I use the terms as compensatory behaviors, meaning people get into it and they're like, yeah. And over time, they're not even aware of the like, yeah. And then they just get lost, and then over time, it's just like, oh, it stopped. And there's so much conversation today, of course, on fixing that, which stopped it. And no one wants to back up and go, well, what was your intentions getting in? And
Right.
so all of those things over there, Robbie, I think I'm defining as the vices inside of it. So
Right.
burning out over, uh, what's the opposite of reward the pacer? Oh, I know. Competition on a whiteboard every day. So that's that's
Yeah,
what I
and
was.
a couple of things come to mind there. So I guess one, to clarify for people, we don't mean vice. When I use the term vices, it's just the connection to the moral language, but we don't
Yes.
mean metaphysical sins or anything like that, or
Yes.
cardinal sins. We just mean
Yeah. Well,
less.
they're cardinal sins in my book of fitness, but go on.
Right. The second thing I was just thinking as we were discussing that is, I was kind of wondering, maybe there's a bi-directional arrow here, but I was kind of wondering, what is the extent to which, if someone has some vices, say selfishness or something to that effect, does that lead to participating or wanting to participate in certain fitness activities? So like the desire for those fitness activities and these things that we're criticizing to a certain extent comes from maybe part of uh, one's internal habits and ways of looking at things. But then I also wonder in the other direction, to what extent does engaging in these types of activities, where it's up on the whiteboard every day and did you beat the other person, does that contribute to a negative state of character? So I'm kind of wondering about the arrows and directions there. Any thoughts on those?
Yeah, for sure. Well, when you say the selfishness aspect, I immediately go to probably an unconscious starting point towards autonomy. That's what I first think about in selfishness. So like and this is where, of course, like you said, some characteristics of specific classifications of virtues like selfishness could be lumped in right or wrong very easily,
Right.
And so selfishness inside of fitness, I classify as the deepest underpinnings of autonomy, and the starting point for autonomy. So I'll just leave that there. And then your other one, on the competition. How did you phrase that? The competition that is on the whiteboard that.
So I agree with you on selfishness. I mean, there are different ways to characterize it, and that could be a good impulse in a certain context. Let me use another vice and maybe see if I can do a better job of explaining. I was wondering the extent to which, let's take impatience.
Mm-hmm.
To what extent does impatience as a general feature of a human being contribute to them then wanting to pursue these particular fitness activities? And then how do those fitness activities contribute to impatience
Yeah,
and
well, I
other
do
things?
want to come back to what you used because I had a point of thought on the second arrow angle. But impatience, that can be very positive in people moving beyond mediocrity in their fitness participation and physical experience. And there is aspects of impatience that are really good on pushing up against potential. So for someone who's new and who cannot express really challenging physical challenges, to be impatient is actually not too bad of a characteristic to have, because you're trying to push up against that which you truly can't express, but at least you're trying to express it. So you're impatient in that you want more and you want it frequently, you want it faster. But that's the beauty inside of fitness sometimes, is you actually can't express it, but it's actually developing some good habits of you pushing up against your potential. So I think that could be in fitness, it could be a positive attribute and a possible area of virtue. So now we're, I guess, stretching it out that these virtues may change over time. And that's where we talk about, the long-term development in autonomy, is that you go from this unconscious incompetent state to this unconscious competent state. So I can see impatience being embedded into that unconscious incompetent state as being a positive virtue. Because you're basically like knocking your head against the wall every day, which is your limitation, but it's a soft wall, if that makes sense. It's just like, oh, okay, that's there. Oh, okay, that's there. Oh, okay, that's there. Whereas over time, when you develop your nervous system more effectively, you beat your head against a really hard wall. And now you've got to deal with this, like, well, what's it like to be impatient when your system gets developed? Now it leads to what we were previously talking about in this downward spiral, Robbie. Okay. So that's what I thought about for that virtue possibly being inside of there. And that stretches my brain a lot, because I'm sure there's now a timeline of people's experiences inside of physical expression and knowledge and competency of its expression, that some of those virtues can be interplaced, that could be helpful and harmful.
Right. And that gets to exactly what you were saying, I think, earlier about, like, what do these words actually mean? Because when I think of, so I see what you're saying. So you could have someone who's impatient, but in the sense of they keep wanting to extend themselves and to actually come back the next day and actually push up against the potential. I was initially thinking of it in the true vice sense of, like, you try to give someone something sustainable and, do these activities and build their strength. And it's like, oh my God, I need the Metcon, or why am I not squatting 600 pounds? Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yep.
that type of thing. So, but it really, there's a spectrum, of course. It
Yes.
depends on, like, what we mean by the term.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you remember your second arrow point?
Yeah. The second arrow point is basically, to what extent does fitness can certain forms of fitness contribute to vices in the character of a human being? In other words, like, if you are constantly in this competitive mode each day, or in this go, 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 can you then become a more impatient person, or a less generous person, or less temperate person, things of that nature?
Yeah. Yeah. And thank you. And what I was going to say on that is, I think the more and more people do that, I think it moves to a lack of awareness. So people become less aware over time and do more, and they start thinking less. And so I think that probably leads to a broken system if you're participating in that direction, where you're just, it's always competition. Because I'm just trying to think, well, I always ask the question, right? Like, number one, what's the hurry? And number two, what's next? And when you try to answer those two things, they're both going to lead to lowering of awareness, and then eventually a burnt out system. So that's why I don't think that's a virtuous path.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think there's a certain extent to which, certain things that we try to cultivate in our life about humility or perseverance or self-discipline can be negatively impacted by the physical pursuits. So there's this bidirectionality going on, where who you are as a person can impact your fitness journey, and your fitness journey can impact who you are as a person.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Are there any other unique virtues that you can think of in fitness? I think we listed a few good ones. I'm trying to think of.
Yeah. I think one area, Robbie, where you can maybe think about, just for our time, just kind of touching on some stuff. I'm not sure if we want to go there, but I think it may be a positive idea to go to a coach's lens, either today or another time. a coach's lens of what is virtuous. So
Yeah.
virtues of coaching, and
Yeah.
because I've classified some attributes of coaching, things like attentiveness and awareness, authenticity, vulnerability, empathy, or creating empathy. I think those are some we can probably dig in on, but I'm just make mentioning of that to see if you have any thoughts on some of those things that could be just embedded inside of the individual fitness landscape of virtuous, um, practices.
Yeah, I mean, I think, awareness, authenticity, those ones you mentioned, but you're right. I mean, we've really just been focused on the individual. And I think that's one I think could even be its own podcast, or even multiple podcasts, of like coach to client, client to coach,
Yeah, yeah.
coach to collective. But
Okay. Well, we can do that another time. We'll do a client to coach perspective and then back to coach to client perspective. But I guess to answer your question, I guess there's probably numerous ones with different pieces of language inside of that. And as I rehash it, maybe something will come up. But I talked about, to redefine that, I talked about, strategy, and I also talked about pace, and I also talked about potential. And I think those are are probably, they very well could be just a triad that has different things underneath them, like that people will extract from them in participation. But they could be some nice beacons for people to think about as what could be some virtues that we're searching for inside of fitness.
yeah, I think those are good ones. And I think they definitely relate to the broader virtues of what it is to be a good human being. Um, and then the last question I had, is I was saying earlier that for Aristotle, the virtuous life is intrinsically linked with this notion of eudaimonia, fulfillment, happiness, the true, good, purposeful life. Um, is there any similar thing in fitness that is intrinsically worthwhile that we are pursuing in the fitness life? And the first thing I thought was autonomy.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm just curious to hear your thoughts. Are we aiming for that eudaimonia in fitness? Are we aiming for autonomy? What's the intrinsically worthwhile thing that we are aiming at when we are engaging in fitness?
Yeah, as you were saying it, I was trying to come up with something different than how I define autonomy, but I'm not getting much more, because inside of what's underneath autonomy for me is is the ability really to use that base support of your physical expression experience for almost anything. And I know anything's a large word, but when you know what you're capable of, and when you know what your limits are, and you know what you need to do for those pieces of strategy and pace and potential, I really do think, you sound cliche, the sky's the limit. So I'm not sure if there's, I'm not attaching to any other things. Now, I think some things which can move into this category, besides just autonomy, would be something, I guess, slightly different in that. And this is where I level the self, others, system, collective perspective, of, I think what could be virtuous over time is that you learn how to be autonomous, and then it moves into helping others. So helping others and community and shared physical experiences, such that it helps more than you, and you're doing it for more than just yourself now, because you have an unbelievable base support. I think that is a possible next evolution of that. But I think, Robbie, it's so hard for me to say that that is actually a virtuous thing, because I just can't see it as a general thing in my lifetime where people get so autonomous in their physical expression they're capable of helping others or teaching others.
Right.
And that needs a lot of defining before I just say that, oh, there's lots of people out helping others. Like, no, it's really not happening, and we'd have to define that. But excuse me, I think that's where, I would say, is another area of helping your community and doing stuff beyond yourself. But that's where it gets into what I would believe a defined aspect of a path and a way. And I think the way to get to that area, I believe you're possibly not going to even reach in a physical person's lifetime of fitness experience. meaning it's going to take so much work to today anyways, to do this learning around the self and to make the self the best possible. And this is not a narcissistic, self or non-altruistic self perspective, but it's just the biggest potential of the self, before you can get to helping others.
Yeah, and as you were saying that, I was thinking maybe the way I phrased it was problematic. I was trying to relate, you know, the pursuit of virtue to this notion of eudaimonia and what's the equivalent in fitness. But Aristotle famously says we don't pursue eudaimonia for anything else. It by itself is sufficient. Happiness is by itself sufficient. So maybe we say of fitness, just there it is. That's why we pursue fitness,
Yes.
because it's fitness,
Yeah.
because we can, because
Yes.
it's
Because
physical
it
being.
exists, because it can, and yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, because I generally finish that sentence, and it's probably something that's more than just beyond because you can, and that it exists, but that it's for you. You're doing it. You're doing it for you, for the improvement of self,
Right.
right? For the pushing against potential, for the pushing of like, well, what am I? What makes me up? What am I afraid of? And what are my big challenges? And you're going to go out there and practice that every day. And inside of that there's strategy, and inside of there's pace, um, and there's virtue in that.
Right. And it's a lifelong practice that's intrinsically worthwhile.
Yes. Beautiful.
Ooh, that was a good one.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts on virtue in relation to fitness?
Yeah, well, I didn't come up with another V for fitness, so I'll figure out what that could be. But I just wanted to say thank you for laying out the groundwork. It changed my perspective on a couple of things that I can't even recall right now. I got to spend some time with, but on the polarity and also the possible incorrect language I have been using in what was seemingly thought of being an incorrect way of aligning virtue, but really they were just blabbermouth vicing. That was a really nice shift for me, so I appreciate that. And also thank you for the base support of the original humans and the original people that came up with some of these things that we could use as language. And also I appreciate us being able to go back and think about how that physical culture ties into what currently we do to today. That's always pleasurable for me, so I really appreciate that. But I have nothing else to add for our conversation. Just an appreciation for us being able to do it.
Yeah, and thank you. I mean, just one thing that sticks out to me from the conversation is just or many things, but one thing in particular is I don't know that we could even have this conversation about fitness and its relation to virtue outside of what we've been talking about as fitness, kind of this truer, deeper
Right.
notion of fitness. It would just be kind of a what are we even talking about with F45 and do you know what I mean? Like,
Yep. Yep.
so we're even able to have this conversation because of this deeper notion of fitness. So
Yeah.
that's
And the base
a cool thing.
support. Yeah. And the
Yes,
base support that we have proposed. Yeah. I agree.
agreed.
Super.
Awesome. All right. Well, James, thank you very much.
All right.